A lot of people say that Toronto has good transit by North American standards. That's something that I tend to agree with. But the network simply hasn't kept pace with the city's growth, especially here in downtown.
Fundamentally, we haven't added any transit capacity other than more GO trains, basically in the last 40 plus years.
So we're finally changing all of that with the Ontario Line, a state-of-the-art automated metro that'll slice through downtown and plug right into our regional rail network. Construction is well underway, and this might all be done by 2031, which actually wouldn't be that bad, except for the fact that Toronto has needed this subway for decades, especially with traffic getting worse and dangerous overcrowding at Bloor-Yonge Station. What's even more painful is that we could have built something like the Ontario Line in the 50s, the 80s, and even late 2000s. But every time, it went a little something like this.
Subways. They don't want these damn streetcars.
We burn that money, it's gone.
Then should be ashamed of herself.
The Ontario Line shows us just how narrow the window of opportunity is to build these politicized, generation-defining transit projects. And in this video, we'll see how Toronto is finally getting it done. Before we talk about subways, we have to talk about streetcars.
We also need to talk about Queen Street, home to some of Toronto's best food, culture, and soft serve that's $10 after tax.
Queen has been an extremely busy transit corridor since the 1890s, so it's the starting point for our story about a downtown subway.
With streetcar ridership growing quickly by the turn of the 20th century, there were calls to build a streetcar tunnel under part of Queen to avoid busy intersections in the city center. These proposals didn't go very far, but the idea really gained traction towards the end of World War II. Rationing during the war meant that for a brief moment, people stopped driving cars and piled onto public transit, leaving many operators across North America in strong financial positions by the time Oppenheimer reached 1 hour, 55 minutes, and 47 seconds.
In particular, the Toronto Transit Commission, or TTC, managed to amass a healthy $25 million surplus. And with traffic congestion getting worse, it made sense to use this money to build Canada's first subway.
A plan was made in 1945 with 2 lines, one going north-south on Yonge, which would be a proper subway, and one going east-west on Queen, which would be a tunnel for the existing streetcars. The idea was put to the public, and it passed with an incredible 89% of the vote. Unfortunately, federal funding for part of the construction costs fell through, so the TTC scoped down the project to only include the Yonge subway. The subway was actually a pretty big deal when it opened, reflecting Toronto's booming growth. With the north-south part of the original plan complete, the city turned their attention back to the east-west portion along Queen.
But the original idea for a streetcar tunnel now seemed inadequate, since it wouldn't add enough capacity to keep pace with long-term growth. So, 2 subway proposals were created.
Option 1, favored by city planners, still ran along Queen as part of a larger U. This idea started on Bloor in the west, before swinging down and traveling along Queen through downtown, then turning north towards the Danforth and continuing east. Option 2 was suggested by the TTC, who stuck with a simpler approach that had already worked for the Yonge subway. Just take the busiest streetcar line and replace it with a subway, which meant running a subway along Bloor-Danforth. Option 2 was eventually selected, for several reasons.
The fundamental advantage of which was being further north, Bloor was more of a continuous street across the city. It meant that the line was more useful as a cross-city route, as much as just a downtown commuter route.
With the Bloor-Danforth line, commuters aren't forced to detour south through downtown just to get across the city, like they would have with the Big U, perhaps preventing Toronto from developing the kind of radial network that so many North American cities are now saddled with. And this is Jonathan English, a researcher and historian who you might recognize from this Vox video. He's also been advocating for a downtown subway like the Ontario line since the beginning of time.
I think with hindsight, I'm glad that we have the Bloor subway because it makes Toronto have more of a complete network.
And I have to include my favorite piece of trivia. The Bloor-Danforth line was made easier because of some clever foresight some 50 years earlier in 1918. That was when the Prince Edward Viaduct was opened to span the Don River Valley, and designers managed to include an additional lower deck in anticipation of a subway being built one day. It was a move that was very expensive during construction, but one that saved even more money when the line was finally opened, nearly half a century later. We don't do this kind of stuff anymore, but there was actually a big missed opportunity here to build both subways, one on Bloor-Danforth and one on Queen.
We actually came very close. They were just a little bit short in terms of money.
The plan with both lines would have taken an extra 5 years to construct and be 34% over budget, so it was understandably rejected. Which is funny, because 5 years late and 34% over budget doesn't even sound that bad nowadays.
I think that would have actually been a pretty good network, all things considered.
That's why in 1966, the subway ended up on Bloor-Danforth and not Queen. Again, this was not a mistake in isolation.
And Queen, to some extent, was put on the back burner.
As Toronto rolled into the 80s, downtown was growing quickly and the subway just wasn't keeping up. Ridership on the Yonge subway began hitting maximum capacity during peak hours, and Bloor-Yonge Station was becoming a dangerous choke point. To be fair, planners had assumed that a Queen subway would be built shortly after the Bloor-Danforth line, so Bloor-Yonge Station was never supposed to become a critical interchange.
Then, in 1985, something very important happened. The Blue Jays won their first division title. The other important thing was that the TTC came up with an idea called Network 2011.
It called for 3 rapid transit lines, including something called the Downtown Relief Line.
They needed to find a way to relieve the congestion on those lines, and so the way that they figured out was to build a kind of J-shaped line that would go from somewhere like Pape Station down to somewhere in the downtown core.
Some of these alignment options were pretty insane, including one idea to elevate the track in between the Public Dominion building and Union Station, then build a massive elevated platform right here in front of Union, which would cover up this entire area. Yeah, I don't know if I can get behind this one.
The plan was budgeted at $2.7 billion, with 75% of funding coming from the province.
And just as the plan came out in 1985, there was a change in provincial leadership.
The outgoing group of Conservatives under Premier Bill Davis actually had a bit of a track record of backing major capital projects, so maybe Network 2011 would have happened had they stayed in power.
And just to illustrate how Davis approached transportation, he strongly opposed the Spadina Expressway that would have put a highway right through where I'm standing, and also stopped me from getting my majestic shawarma. That was good. Davis notably said that if we wanted to build transportation that served people, not cars, the Spadina Expressway was a good place to stop. But let's go back to Network 2011.
Approval was naturally delayed when a new party, David Peterson's Liberals, came to power during that 1985 change.
This was a plan that just didn't really end up going all that far. Part of the problem was that the downtown councillors, and Jack Layton most famously, were very opposed to the idea of another subway into the downtown core because they thought that it would bring excessive, as they would have seen it at that time, development in the downtown core.
The Liberals eventually came up with their own plan called Let's Move, which incorporated key elements of Network 2011, but without a downtown relief line.
In many ways, the relief line, while a useful transit project, was not necessarily one that had a lot of strong political backing.
And just to illustrate how hard it was to build any rapid transit during this time, let alone the relief line, let's see how far we got with Let's Move. The Liberals only lasted 5 years, with Bob Rae's NDP being elected in 1990, and Let's Move was morphed into the Rapid Transit Expansion Program. Then, in 1995, there was another leadership change, this time going back to the Conservatives under Mike Harris. But Harris came to power on an austerity platform that he called the Common Sense Revolution, which unsurprisingly saw massive cuts in transit funding. To top it all off, he filled in a hole that had already been dug for a station on Eglinton. And by that time, the window of opportunity to build a relief line had already closed.
The city was hit by a really big recession in the early 90s, and it took over a decade, well over a decade, for transit ridership to recover. So there wasn't really the same need for a relief to the subway because it wasn't as congested as it was in the 80s.
Of all the ideas considered since the original Network 2011 plan, only the Shepherd subway was built. It eventually opened in 2002, and we'll see in a bit why this is very important for the Ontario line. Toronto eventually pulled out of the recession and started growing again. Probably because the Jays won back-to-back World Series titles.
Touch 'em all, Joe! You'll never hit a bigger home run in your life!
But the return of downtown growth also meant the return of overcrowding on the Yonge subway. This was quite concerning for Toronto's mayor at the time, David Miller of the NDP. So in 2007, he announced Transit City, which would be a massive light rail network across Toronto. I won't go into too much detail about these routes, but what's relevant for this video is that there was no downtown relief line. Not that it would have mattered. A relief line needed to be a subway to get into downtown, but Transit City was very explicitly a light rail plan.
It was always intended to be an LRT plan. not a plan that considered any other modes.
A big reason for this focus was cost, or what I'll describe as the idea of cost. Because remember the Shepherd subway? When it opened in 2002, it had somehow become the most expensive subway that Toronto had ever built, coming in at nearly twice the cost per kilometer of the Downsview extension that opened just 6 years prior. So one theory is that Transit City decided to tackle these cost increases by building light rail, unfortunately missing the point of what actually makes projects expensive. It's true that light rail is generally quite a bit cheaper to build than subways, but only if you keep costs under control.
I know it sounds obvious, but Transit City ignored this one simple truth, that if you're not disciplined about costs, your project will be expensive no matter what you build. It could be a subway, light rail, or even a bike lane.
This discipline really matters when it comes to soft costs, things like insurance or contingency budgets. That's because these costs are largely derived from processes, not physical infrastructure. So it's easy to have inefficient processes that, for example, perceive everything as risky, making you pad the budget with contingencies. A study of 6 recent projects in North American cities shows just how much money is spent on soft costs versus building the actual thing. Compare this to best practice projects in other geographies. Spending this much on soft costs really shouldn't be the default. Here's where I think Transit City fell short. It saw how expensive the Shepherd subway was, came to the surface level conclusion that subways are expensive, then jumped straight to building light rail instead of fixing what went wrong with the delivery of Shepherd, missing yet another opportunity to build a downtown subway.
Now, I'm definitely not saying that I think Transit City should have just been built using subways. I'm just trying to explain why I think the reasoning for using light rail wasn't fully genuine. Because the lines that did survive from Transit City, like the Finch West LRT, are actually more expensive per kilometer than the Shepherd subway itself, which was the very project with the high costs that were supposed to be avoided by using light rail.
And then if you want to put on your tinfoil hat, take a look at Transit City's routes, then look at where the Shepherd, Eglinton West, and downtown subway extensions were supposed to go. But a more obvious limitation of Transit City was that it would likely funnel thousands of additional commuters into a subway system that was already at capacity. So Jonathan and his friends started a Facebook group.
Within a few weeks, we had, city councilors joining, newspapers calling. It was the era when everybody was obsessed with the power of Facebook.
Yes.
Eventually, a downtown relief line slipped back into consideration, with Metrolinx highlighting the need for such a project in their Big Move regional transportation plan. This is just one example of the power of advocacy, and if you're based in Toronto, you should check out TTC Riders if you want to get involved.
And just to make myself very clear, I think Transit City was flawed, but it wasn't a mistake.
It created a lot of excitement in the city around we're finally getting significant transit expansion.
Psych! That's the wrong number!
Rob Ford became mayor in 2010 and cancelled Transit City.
Subways, they don't want these damn streetcars.
What's relevant for this video is that Ford really wanted subways. This was all part of his promise to end the war on cars by getting rid of light rail projects. Ford cycled through various ideas, but eventually put together a plan that involved extending the Shepherd subway, completing the Eglinton and Finch light rails as subways, and building a small section of the relief line from Queen to Pape. And even though it wasn't clear where the money would come from, the relief line was back on the table.
Before we go any further, we have to take a little detour. Because Toronto was actually already in the middle of expanding the subway. The extension of Line 1 from Downsview, now Shepherd West, up to York University and Vaughan Metropolitan Centre.
This extension was largely separate from Transit City, with a different funding structure. And before you ask why this extension could happen, but a relief line couldn't, the honest answer is I don't know.
But the York extension matters because it descended into a dumpster fire, which significantly changed how future transit projects in Toronto would be built, including the Ontario line.
The Toronto-York Spadina subway extension was a solid idea. York University is Canada's 3rd largest, and most students had to pack onto an express bus to get there from the subway.
Like all subway projects up until that point, the TTC was responsible for delivering it. The problem was that they did so in what might have been the most expensive way possible.
The approach to building subways that we had been using was very much a bored tunnel, big stations. It's the highest cost model that you can kind of follow. Quite different from, say, the Bloor-Danforth subway, which has quite Spartan stations. A lot of it was done cut and cover. They elevated it in various sections where that was feasible and not too disruptive.
If you want to learn more about what makes transit projects expensive, check out Nandert's transit cost video.
When it was all said and done, the York extension cost $3.2 billion. And that's close to double the cost per kilometer of the Shepherd subway, which itself was double the cost per kilometer of whatever came before it.
And geometric means that we're multiplying by the same quantity.
So, in 2012, the province decided that they would be better at building and delivering Toronto's transit projects, not the TTC. Metrolinx, essentially a provincial agency, was quietly put in charge of delivering 4 projects that were already in the pipeline, while the TTC would remain as operators. This will be very important for the Ontario line.
But before we get there, just take a guess at which projects Metrolinx would deliver first. Go ahead. Just take a guess.
We have this idea that Transit City was killed. It wasn't. The most expensive parts of it have all been built or are being built.
That's right. Metrolinx was going to deliver 4 light rail projects straight out of Transit City.
I am inevitable.
While all that drama with the York extension was happening, the Rob Ford era ended unceremoniously. But for once, the relief line didn't fade away with a change in power. It was clear that the subway couldn't be expanded anywhere if overcrowding in the core wasn't addressed. The TTC had actually been studying a downtown line in the background, and in 2016, a relief line corridor from Pape Station to downtown was even approved by City Council. But it would cost nearly $7 billion, which the city didn't have, all while the transfer of project delivery powers to the province also left Toronto's transit in a bit of a grey area. And before that could get sorted out, Doug Ford was elected Premier of Ontario in 2018. Yes, Doug Ford is Rob Ford's brother. And yes, Doug also really liked subways.
I want to build subways.
But there was still the possibility that Doug would come in and just cancel everything that Metrolinx was working on. After all, that's essentially what happened in the 80s.
But Doug didn't blow everything up, because there's one final piece to the puzzle. Metrolinx CEO Phil Verster. This next bit is a touch speculative, so take it with a grain of salt. Verster arguably positioned Metrolinx as an agency that could build the subways that Ford wanted, and take the blame if necessary. This got Metrolinx on Ford's good side, allowing them to continue building transit. Researcher Stephen Wickens has an amazing quote about what this compromise looked like, saying that instead of making evidence-based decisions, Metrolinx instead became really good at producing decision-based evidence. And in 2019, there was just one final hiccup. The city had already done the studies and approved an alignment for the relief line, but Ford wanted something bigger. Metrolinx agreed, likely for more practical reasons. The agency has a mandate to improve the entire region, which made a longer, more comprehensive line more attractive.
So in April 2019, Doug Ford announced a new transit plan that would double the length of the relief line, turning it into the $10.9 billion Ontario line that would be delivered by Metrolinx. And a lot of people got very angry.
Many were concerned that a change in plans would undo years and millions of dollars of work that had already gone into planning the relief line. The public also wasn't exactly thrilled with how Metrolinx were handling the Eglinton Crosstown. But later that year, the city agreed to support the new Ontario line in exchange for the province dropping its plan to take over the entire subway. Yeah, that was a whole thing.
Ford put the finishing touches on this whole endeavor by passing the Building Transit Faster Act. This let them cut down some trees a bit quicker. And in 2022, construction finally began on the Ontario line. There are, unfortunately, still some very real problems with the Ontario line.
Efforts were made to rein in hard costs, like using surface alignments where available, or running smaller and more frequent trains to shrink station sizes. But the Ontario line still sat at around $700 million per kilometer when it was announced, and that number has only grown. $700 million is getting close to double the cost per kilometer of the York extension, which you probably remember was double that of the Shepherd subway, which was double of whatever came before it.
And geometric means that we're multiplying.
So we clearly haven't fixed the cost problems, which means that for the amount we're paying, we should really be getting like 3 Ontario lines.
But for what it's worth, it's still a pretty good project.
It's arguably priceless, because without downtown relief, the subway cannot be meaningfully expanded anywhere. It's gotten to the point where Toronto needs to build this line at any cost. And one advantage of having a provincial agency in charge is that the line is being built with the interests of the entire region in mind.
Rather than really just being strictly a relief line, it's actually significantly improving transit access to a lot of different parts of the city.
The Ontario line crucially ties into Metrolinx's ambitious GO expansion.
GO expansion is bringing us commuter rail on steroids, with all-day 15-minute two-way service. This is a nation-changing plan, but it won't go very far if all these trains just funnel everyone into a choke point at Toronto's Union Station. That's why the stations at Exhibition and East Harbour are so important. Commuters coming in from the suburbs can get off at these stations and switch to the Ontario line, alleviating pressure on Union and also making it more convenient to get to Queen or Bloor.
The Ontario line can act almost as a last-mile connector, allowing more people to live further away from the city and redirecting pressure from the subway onto the GO network, which has capacity to take more people with massive 12-car trains. Yeah, like that one.
There's also a few more ideas that I didn't get to talk about. Go Urban was a maglev plan in the 70s. One City in 2012 was Transit City on steroids. And Smart Track was a whole thing in 2014.
My last video talked about all the missed opportunities that Chicago had to build a crosstown line. And the crazy thing is, Toronto has had just as many missed opportunities. My point is, things can change, and they can change quickly. One way to accelerate that change is to donate your time or money to advocacy groups, if you're able to do so. TTC Riders here in Toronto is a great organization to look into.
And a huge thank you to everyone who took the time and effort to leave such detailed responses to my Google form. I've only had the chance to reach out to some of you, but I have read every single response, and I definitely think that there's a way to channel this energy, probably first by connecting people with advocacy groups. I'm unfortunately quite busy through the end of 2024, but I fully intend to dive into this in the new year. If you haven't already, feel free to leave your thoughts in that form, and hopefully I can find a way to try and mobilize this all, because I really think there's something here.
And when the Ontario line is finally done, the only people that'll remember any of this are you guys, the ones who have watched to the very end.
It's been over 100 years, and it's pretty remarkable to see the hole finally in the ground on Queen Street.